Welcome, everyone, to this fourth in our series with the panel of diverse faculty fostering uh, questions on higher education and diversity in higher education. Today, our focus is a second part on BIPOC students and providing information and tips on how to navigate in school and in career around issues looking at diversity, racism, discrimination, things like that. So welcome. I'm Dr. Sonia Sutherland. I am on faculty at Richmond Graduate University in Atlanta, Georgia, where I serve as an associate professor, dean of assessment planning and accreditation, and director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. I am joined by fabulous peers that I will allow to introduce themselves before we get going. So I'm going to throw it to you, Dr. Chan.
Thank you, Dr. Sutherland. Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Christian Chan. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. It is so good to see y'all. I know that everybody's been privy to our recording, but as much as today is a conversation. We certainly we appreciate the questions, the viewpoints that we're sharing, and at the same time, we also know that thank you for joining us together in community here. So appreciate y'all, and I will pass it to Dr. Sean Smith.
Thank you. Good afternoon and good morning, wherever you're at in this space called world. I'm Dr. Sean Smith. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I identify as a cisgender male. I am a person of faith, Christian. I'm also a veteran, a dad, a brother, nephew, an uncle, and a grandson, and a Black man. I teach at North Carolina A&T, so yes, Dr. Chan and I are neighbors. I teach in our counselor education program, and I've been a professional counselor now over 27 years and supervisor over 25, and this is my 21st year in the classroom teaching. So as Dr. Chan has alluded to, think of what we're going to do today. Think of this conversation of us either at the bar or your recreational outing with an adult beverage or a non-adult beverage, and we're just sitting down and we're eating on some good food and having some good conversation. Welcome. And Dr. Elizabeth Suarez.
Yes. Hi, everybody. I am, as he said, Dr. Elizabeth Suarez. I've been counting while you were talking, Sean, at 25 years in the field, working in online, face-to-face, hybrid situations. I am the coordinator for the PhD in Counselor Ed and Supervision at Walden University, and also the research coordinator, so oversee all the dissertations and research. I am a Latina woman and excited to be here. Like they said, it's been fun to prepare because we get to talk about our different experiences, and we hope that you will benefit from that too. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. And so you guys had the fun of sharing your heritage. I think I want to do that. And then Christian, if you want to do that too, you can. So I am of Cuban Jamaican descent, grew up in Brooklyn, New York. So put all of that together and have lived in Atlanta in the last 25 years. So add that on to that cultural piece as well. I'm a mother of two, a divorced single woman, add that perspective as well. I identify as she, her, hers. And I think that's all that I can remember to share right now. Christian, did you want to add on anything?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Sutherland. Who I am centrally as I live in the world, right, is a queer person of color. And so, but not only beyond that, right, it's like I've faced the nexus of like racism, heterosexism, and colonialism, but also at the same time, also walk into spaces with many other forms of privilege. So I'm someone who's a queer person of color. I'm someone who has multiple heritages, particularly as a brown second generation Asian American. The other piece here is that in terms of my ethnic background and heritage, I'm Filipino, Chinese, and Malaysian. One of the other pieces that's part of the way that I also understand how I'm situated in the world is that I'm a cisgender male. I'm also someone who also has who grew up as a child of two immigrants, and that has played a huge part in my own familial capital, by my own familial lineage, and also watching the economic hardships of both my parents as immigrants. Despite that, I also grew up in a middle-class family with access to education, career opportunities, and a PhD. I'm also someone who is able-bodied, and I think that certainly is something that we need to continuously consider and discuss, particularly as we talk about disability justice. So with that being said, spiritually, I'm a pluralistic Catholic who's centered in liberation theology.
All right, thank you so much. All right, so we'll get going. As we said in our February 4th presentation, I wasn't there, but as my peers did say, we received so many questions from you all around the issue of BIPOC students navigating school and career post-graduation, that we didn't have time to cover all of it. And so we have the second one scheduled today to continue covering what you sent in before. And we want to ask you and invite you to also add questions today in the Q&A, because we would love to be able to field those as well for you, and have you be as involved as possible. Keep checking the chat as well. Dr. Chen has fantastic resources that just seem to pop out after, no matter what we talk about, and he's going to put those in the chat as well as it comes up. And so hopefully by the time you end today, you will have gained from what looks like 80, 90 years total of professional history between the four of us, as well as relating with each other through the Q&A and the chat. All right, so we'll get started. And the first area that we're going to cover, there are three today: microaggressions, coping, and decolonization, and then whatever else you guys add. So we'll start with microaggressions. And one of the questions that has come in is, how do you handle microaggressions from superiors over whom you have little or no power? And a related question as well, and I think probably as we talk about it, it'll get addressed as well. How do you bring up microaggressions done by faculty without ruining potential networking chances that you might need them for? All right, so we'll start with the first one. How do you handle microaggressions from superiors over whom you have very little power? Dr. Suarez, would you like to start?
Sure, I can start. I'm an educator at heart, so I try to educate. And so I thought of one where I was at a school where everyone was doctor, and I had my PhD, but I was introduced as Dr. So-and-so, 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 and Elizabeth. And I was like, and they were all males and white, and I was female and Latina. And so the person that did that, when I finally sat down after doing my presentation, I said, what's wrong with this? And, kind of said, here's how I was introduced. And he, kind of explained that he didn't remember their first names or something like that. But the point being is, like, I'm not okay with this, and trying to educate. So giving them an example, or, that's not the best example, but I'm just saying in terms of, hey, do you know that when you say that, you've just, put me down by using my first name, where everyone else gets their title, even though I worked just as hard for that, even harder, I would say. So, so education for me, but in a non-defensive way. Because I think sometimes if we come in and go, you're wrong, you shouldn't have done that, then you get defensiveness back. And I want to come in just going, hey, what does this sound like to you? Let me tell you what it sounded like to me. So.
Thank you, Dr. Suarez. Dr. Smith, how about you?
I would have to say that this is an area that I have grown into and continue to grow. And my reason for saying that is I certainly responded to that much differently 25 years ago than I would now. I am also very aware and I believe astute regarding the privilege that I bring in some spaces and the privilege that I don't bring in others. And based on that, affords me some level, some additional tools on how to respond. So I say that to say, I use the educational approach. I use the disengagement approach. I use the allyship approach. You know, it may not be direct. It may not come up and may not be directed towards me. But if I'm the bystander, I'm speaking up. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I know where the space is coming from, and it's really not worth my energy. Mm. So it really depends on space, circumstances, and privilege. And as I said, it's taking me some time to get to that point to identify the different skills and tools that I have to respond. Because I can say 20, 25 years ago, there was only one response. and that response was basically anger, if that makes sense. It was basically anger. And we know what happens if anger's driving things. We may get the response we want, we may not, but so.
That's great. Dr. Chan, how about you?
So I remember in our first part of this panel, I know I shared the resource about Dr. Loretta Ross and calling in versus calling out. So that is one way, right? So Dr. Suarez and Dr. Smith highlighted this important part about education. So here's something that I always offer to my students, not just teaching the multicultural class, but teaching several other courses. What I often offer is, okay, so here's how sometimes you can think about responding. And I want to give credit to a trainer in Northwest Portland who actually really gave this really good metaphor. They shared, you can respond with the pin or the pin or the hammer. And so, because sometimes it's like, it might just take a pin, right? So, and you can elaborate, you can provide some education, you can take that pin. And then sometimes there are moments when you have to use the hammer. And I think about this, especially for our audience, when you see that there are counselor educators and you see this happening in your classroom between students, or there are times when you see this happening particularly with other colleagues. And so sometimes it's like, okay, hey, I want to make sure that we don't do that, and that's not okay. And I think sometimes we have to make it explicit, right? So it's not just, we're not just going to converse about this. Sometimes we just have to outright say it is not okay for you to do that. And I know that still seems nice and convivial, right? But at the same time, I also want to be very clear and explicit when there are moments when this is not okay. I do say that. And there are times when I also add the education. I give some concrete ideas about why this is not okay. And in terms of the education, what the actual impact, what is the effects of that microaggression, right? So it's not just the intent, because most of the times, many times, microaggressions come from well-intentioned places, right? There are times when people have given me a compliment and I sit there and like, actually this happened once where someone said to me, you know, this is going to come off as a microaggression, but you look really young to be a professor. And I was like, I think your first sign should have been the fact that you already said that. I think that this is a microaggression. So I pointed it out to them and I said, you know, I I feel like what I want to talk about is actually what stereotype you just perpetuated. So we started that conversation and they didn't realize that they had been doing that. And this is why it can be such an antidote, right? When we start to provide some of that education, because think about the long-term effects, right? Of what you just prevented this person from doing in the future. So I think that's why even when, you know, so for some of our counselor educators who are here in the audience with us, when you're seeing this happen in your classroom, the moment you intervene, that is a sign that A, you are protecting all the students in that classroom. And then B, you're preventing this kind of harm from happening to future clients and to future students. And the last piece I will also say, because sometimes if you let that continue to occur, it festers, it proliferates. And what happens is you're basically sanctioning violence in the system. And so that's why because it's always, we often think like people focus so much on the micro, right? And I always say, but you know, those microaggressions always lead to so much more. That is what leads to explicit violence. And so we need to be able to intervene even when these messages are perpetuated.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chan. And you know, I would just add to the wealth of information that my colleagues have provided and say, as you think through how you want to handle those, do it in ways that fit your authentic space and your authentic self, right? Because it won't be the same for everyone. And you have to know that the way you handle it is you, because the more you handle it, the more tiring it will become. And if you handle it in a way that is really not authentic to your natural self, it becomes even more exhausting to try to carry that off. The second thing that I would think about is just be mindful of the experience of gaslighting, right? Sometimes things come our way and it doesn't seem as though it's a microaggression, or it is couched in pretty language, or it is written off. I'm thinking about an experience I'm having right now with the superior, right? And I am sure that the individual would say, this has nothing to do with discrimination and it's not microaggressive. And it could very easily kind of push me back and say, okay, well, this is not involved. Just be careful, right? And be aware of context, be aware of other signs, and don't allow yourselves, or I try not to allow myself to talk myself out of how I feel about what my experience is. I learn to acknowledge and value what my spirit is telling me and not allow someone else to redefine what I'm feeling inside of myself. So I would say that that's also something to think through. And in terms of the idea, the question in terms of ruining potential networking chances that you might need folks for if you confront microaggression, again, your authentic self can inform some of that. I had an experience years ago where I was microaggressed against by someone who thought that as a Black woman, I was taking a space for a white man that I should not and don't have the right to take. At the time, I did not confront it and address it. I did take the education approach because that was my authentic self, and I didn't do it with that person in mind. I did it because that was my space, and that's what I did, right? And in doing that, that person caught on, and years down the road, then said, so let's talk about that because here's what really happened. And now we are colleagues in the sincerest sense, and it has not ruined any networking opportunities, right? And so sometimes it's not immediate. Sometimes it's operate in your advocacy space, operate in your space as, right? And it'll come just because you're being who you are, right? So that's what I would say around things like that as well.
The second part of your the question, Dr. Southern, I appreciate you bringing that piece up and sharing your experience there in regards to that teachable moment, even down the line, because that's also important. But it's also important to also understand and realize you may not need that individual support to get where you're going. And you may not have ever garnered it. That's the other piece. We have to also be able to assess and evaluate who we bring into our space and who really has power over us. Okay? Because if we really do the work, do the self inventory, there isn't a lot of folks that have true authentic power over us, if we are doing what we're supposed to be and being our authentic self in these spaces as well. So I just wanted to share that and be okay with that as well. Because sometimes we beat ourselves up. We just have to be okay with it. Okay, it just wasn't for me, all right? I still try to dunk a basketball, but you know, my 5'9" self won't allow me to do it. And I'm okay with that.
I also, oh, Dr. Suarez, were you trying to say? Oh.
Yeah. No, I was thinking the same thing along the lines of what Dr. Smith was saying, in that, you know, you might think that because other students are flocking to a certain professor, let's say, that that's the one to be around. And if that's the one that you're not getting the support from, or, you know, feeling microaggressed by, I don't think that's going to close doors, because if you did, you would be under that kind of environment if they're not willing to change. You know, and again, I'll go back to education, but if I say a couple of times, you know, hey, this isn't appropriate, there's other ways you could say that, and this faculty member is not open to that, do you really want to be in that environment, like Dr. Smith was saying, of constantly being dismissed, you know, demeaned, whatever the words are? So sorry, that was what I was thinking too. So thank you, Dr. Chan.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm thinking about that second question too, about microaggressions and navigating networks, right? I understand where the question's coming from, because it's also about what happens when I don't, when I'm stuck in a system where I have to report to a superior, or do I have to, how do I put this in a way that still gives me my voice, and I share my voice in an authentic way. And so I think in that vein, and I think this is something that I've been sitting with, you know, I mean, sometimes with, so the first piece about network, remember that there is hope, right? Particularly in terms of when you think about network, that there are so many of us in the profession who are doing the work of healing, and doing the work that is focused on, especially in this particular conversation, on racial equity and justice. And so I think in many ways, like there are so many of us who really believe in the legacy, the mentorship, the collectivism that we garner among ourselves, and why it's so important, and why we continue to give back to the profession in this way. And so there, even for that one experience, that one person that you may be afraid in terms of like, will that ruin my networking chances? Remember that there are so many other people also doing the healing work, and who will be in community and solidarity with you. The other piece I wanted to highlight is I like also the conversation that Dr. Sutherland, Dr. Smith, Dr. Suarez also shared. What's important for us is to do it in this authentic way, right? In ways that really promotes, like, this is how I want to share my voice, right? And because, like, in also making sure that being mindful, especially as we think about, you know, I'm sitting here as someone who often reflects and analyzes what intersectionality really means in our own like systems. The reality is sometimes we also have to be mindful. It's like, what kind of legacy am I creating here, right? For every student, every colleague, every faculty who comes after me. So that's what I often sit with in terms of how do I want to advocate here. I have to do it in a way that, yes, it's authentic. And yes, I also am considering the legacy that comes after me. And so with that being said, in terms of the education piece, what's also really important, and I want to highlight is with the education piece, you know, what's so powerful is that we can also find ways so that the people who we want to listen to us, we want them to listen to us, particularly in a way that says, okay, I don't want you to disengage from this conversation. I want you to still be able to hear me. And I don't want you to disengage from this conversation. So I think that's part of where the mastery lies, right? In responding and dismantling microaggressions.
I'm so glad you said that. If something else pops up for me, even as you say that. So when you spoke about what is the legacy that I want to leave, what you're really talking about is look at the long game, right? Sometimes things happen and they impact us emotionally right in the moment. And the short game is, okay, how do I respond to this in this moment? And sometimes sometimes the response is no response right now, right? Sometimes the response is, let me look at the long game and see if this is a battle or a war. If this is a war, is this the battle that I need to fight right now? Would this be the most strategic, or is there something, right? So you're reading the land really to kind of see how could this play out, and what is it that's really needed? And is it just me, or is it, as you're saying, Dr. Chan, the environment that I'm influencing as well, that is most important, the community that I'm influencing as well in the choice that I make. And that is a heavy burden to bear, to not just think about ourselves individually, but to see ourselves within the collective and understand our impact on the collective and to operate from that realm, right? It is a balance, as you said, Dr. Chan, it really is a balance. And as you said, we don't have to find the balance by ourselves. I was talking with my mentor just an hour ago about a situation, right? And use them, use the community to help you find the balance and even to find your authentic voice if you're not sure where that sits right now. So I really appreciate what you said, Dr. Chan, because I think it really emphasizes some really critical things.
I want to come back to Dr. Sutherland's question about decolonization. So why that's so important, right? Because I think a lot of times we have to be, and I'll share some resources around this, and especially as you deepen your learning about decolonization, it's not necessarily this progressive logic, right? Because I think sometimes people act like, oh, you know, it becomes co-opted into become this progressive logic, like decolonization is just solely synonymous with social justice, right? But decolonization isn't always, the first piece of this, Sandy Grande actually talks about this, where she talks about, you know, sometimes decolonization reminds us that we're not here just, oh yes, so we're not here just to ask for reconciliation, right? That is part of it, but we're not just here to solely ask for reconciliation. It goes beyond reconciliation. What we're also asking for is a change in the order of the world. And so when you think about academia, when you think about counselor education, what we're also asking for is not just reconciliation in counselor education. We're also asking for a change in the order of counselor education. And so that's what we're asking. But when we think about decolonization, there's multiple frameworks and definitions around this. So, but I would like to emphasize that there is, and there's also a distinction between anti-colonial and decolonial and post-colonial. And what I'll offer here is one of the main pieces when we think about decolonization is so much of what it is refusing the ways that colonialism has played a part in our practices, in who we are, and what has actually happened in what we've inherited, what we've been inoculated with. And so that in its own way, when I think about decolonization, right, what I'm also doing is restoring the culture, the indigeneity of an individual and who they are. And so what we're also asking in terms of our counselor education practices is how do we find ways to creatively restore that culture, that indigeneity for many of our BIPOC students. And so when you think about, even start there, right? So, because I think we can easily say, let's like, tell me some practices, tell me some ideas, right? Start there with your intentions. How are you promoting that restoration of the culture and indigeneity of your students, especially BIPOC students? So I think that's when I think about decolonization. The other piece is we want to make sure, especially in this conversation too, like in terms of indigeneity, that's what decolonization certainly emphasizes too, right? Indigeneity and understanding that we are guests on stolen land. And so what that ultimately means is, you know, we have to also continue advocating for that change in the order of the world that promotes the culture, the history of Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples, whose land that we're standing on. And so I think in that vein, especially as you probably heard earlier, for anybody who was here early, you know, Representative Deb Haaland is right now in the midst of confirmation hearings for the Secretary of the Interior for the United States. And that's not only historic, but it's so important for what kind of message it sends. So again, like think about how you're inferring and restoring Indigenous communities, particularly into our work. But also with that being said, we also think about the intersections about in those Indigenous communities. So Indigenous woman, Indigenous queer woman of color. So I think that's also a big part of this conversation too. While everybody's responding, I'll also drop some resources into the chat.
Yeah, so I'll just chime in too. And I think for me, an easy way to think through and apply decolonization in my mind, and then be able to let it kind of filter out into other spaces, is my understanding of the Black church, right? And so when we think about the Black church and how it evolved in slave days and how Christianity was given over, right, or taught to slaves, and that way of using the Christian faith at that point in time was a very colonizing way of using the faith to keep power over slaves. Once they were freed, there was a point where they began to take back the church in terms of rerouting their African roots into how the church looked, how it sounded, how they used the music that brought them through slavery and kept them centered, and brought that into the Christian church that we call the Black American church today, in the different denominations that we know it to be. And I remember at a certain point in that history, there was a break off. There became really educated Blacks, and then there were the uneducated Blacks, and the really educated ones took on the more culturally European way of singing hymns and things like that. Decolonization for me is when I take away that European colonization of those Negro spirituals, those slave hymns that were developed to help us come through slavery, and bring it back to the roots and sing it in the way and think of it in the way that is authentic, and love it in the way that is authentic to the African space that we come from versus the European space that has impacted it. Now, I love my hymns. I'm that girl, right? I love my hymns. I grew up in the Christian church, Southern Baptist Christian church in Brooklyn. Go figure, with a bunch of Jamaicans and Cubans, right? Go figure how that all came together, right? And my mom, educated in England, so she brought that type of music into our life. And so it was just a mix, right? Decolonization says, I'm just reclaiming what's my roots in the things that I have, and not valuing the colonization space of it more than I value what it sounds like when it sounds like my real roots. That's how I think about decolonization. And then it filters over into education and everything else. That's kind of how I think about it.
I think one piece that I'll share is if you're trying to sit with decolonization, of course, like we probably become familiar with that 2012 article by Eve Tuck and Wayne Young, right? Decolonization is not a metaphor. That is that 20, and I'll share that too. The 2012 article is open access. What I will say too is that they also highlight Frantz Fanon's work. So you can't really talk about decolonization without talking about Frantz Fanon. So I think that's the other piece. I'll also add in several scholars in terms of decolonization, like Walter Mignolo. And so again, like because when you think about decolonization, right, it's tied to European imperialism and how it's essentially co-opted, centered European imperialism and white supremacy in those ways, right? And to co-opt all these other pieces, particularly of BIPOC people's cultures.
All right, so we will move on now to coping. And the first question that we have is, how can I combat the feelings of anxiety and nervousness when entering rooms where I am the only Black person? How can I combat the feelings of anxiety and nervousness when entering rooms where I am the only Black person? And we can generalize that to BIPOC individual as well, right? Dr. Suarez, do you want to start?
Well, no, in that and here's why. I can pass, and so I can walk into a room and people make the assumption that I am white. And even if they talk to me, because they have stereotypes that, you know, I should be speaking with a Latin accent if I'm Latina. And so anyway, I don't have that experience. I have the opposite, and I can talk about that later, about trying to explain that I am not white, and that, you know, I had an experience. I'm on a community mental health board, and they were like, "We don't have any diversity on this board," and I'm like, "Whoa, hello," but even not being seen that way. So but that's another question. So I'm gonna pass on this one because I don't know what it's like to walk in and be assumed all these things that get put on people that look different than the majority.
And I apologize as I'm transitioning from the decolonization question to this, because it's always intersections on this piece. I guess I would say to kind of to help me transition is also when we're talking about decolonization and just the process of getting there, I think we often spend that time on the environment and the social piece, right? Without thinking about mentally and emotionally what that means, right? And I think that's important, because when we take something away, we have to replace it with something. And my question is, are those anxieties and fears there outside of a counseling or educational setting if you're the only? Because I'm one that always goes back to reality in real world, because counseling programs and classrooms and institutions, those ivory towers, there's still a level of reality that's going on in there. And so this is what I mean. If I'm walking into a department store, if I'm at a sporting event, if I am going into the bank and I'm the only, and oftentimes I am, how am I handling my anxiety in those spaces just as I would in the classroom? So my question is that truly a new phenomenon to you? If it is, then we can sit down and talk about how to develop skills, both behavioral and the vocabulary to address that. If it's not, reassess those experiences that you've been the only Now, I've been blessed the last 2 years. I work at an HBCU, all right? So I'm not the only in my workspace for the first time in many, many years. When I first got into the field in community counseling, I was in a predominantly Black and Brown agency providing services to the community. We look like the community. But my higher ed experience has been predominantly at PWIs, small, large, research ones in between, and some for-profit institutions. So now that experience is a lot different, and there are some privileges to that, but guess what? There are still some isms to that as well. The one being just being in the field of counseling. Being a man in counseling, we're the minority. We are the minority.
Mhm.
And what does that mean in that space? So you can be one with privilege, and you can be marginalized simultaneously, or just by walking down the hall. All right. Our building next door is engineering. The engineering faculty are predominantly men. So in a matter of 50 steps, I can shift that privilege and move from a different status. But I'm going back to the original question. What is your experience just in any setting being the only? I don't want us to get into the facade, my language, of thinking because we're in a counseling program that these issues are not there. All right, they are there, and we have to be prepared to respond to them the best way that we can. So that's where I would start.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. I think what you've talked about sparked a lot of things in me, because I've had that experience of feeling anxious and nervous when walking into a room. And I've had the experience of not feeling that way as well. So when I used to still be a member of the Southern Baptist Convention and went to church here in Georgia, I was one of few Blacks at that church. And the only one who at one point was on staff. And so, yeah, I would walk into a room and be the only one, but I walked in in many cases, I didn't walk in feeling like I was in a down position. I didn't have the anxiety. I didn't have the nervousness. I don't have that when I walk into a bank. I did have it when I walked into academia. There were expectations of me that I perceived, whether I put them on myself or someone else put them on me, that influenced that, I think. In my church setting, I knew the skill I brought. I was confident in the skill I brought to what I was doing at that church in music. And so there wasn't that issue. Being new to academia, though, I was just beginning to understand the skill that I brought, wasn't sure about it. And so I remember walking into the building, having to go to a reception and looking in the room and walking straight past the door and down the hall to regroup and to kind of get myself ready to walk in the room to experience whatever it was that I was going to experience. And part of it was I didn't know what I was going to experience, right? And then the other part of it came with just being new to academia. That is not as prominent now in my experience, right? Years down the road, it doesn't feel the same way. Now, if I were to walk into a larger university, to a president's cabinet meeting and be the only Black female in the room, I might have some nervousness and anxiety walking into the room because it's a different space. It's a new space. And I have to figure out how am I navigating the space? And when I know it and understand it, that goes away. So I just think some of this is beginning to learn yourself, validate yourself, know who you are and what you bring to the table, and value what you bring to the table to any room that you're walking into, regardless of whether or not you are the only BIPOC person in that room. And I think that our sociopolitical context also plays a role in how we take on anxiety and nervousness walking into a room and being the only person of color. Our experiences of racial trauma still are present in our bodies and impact some of that. We know experiences that we've had that maybe we haven't talked through and resolved, and that's playing a part in how you feel walking into a room as the only person of color. So, I mean, there's so many things, right? There is the immediate, and then there are all those other things that really are important to have had conversation about, therapy about, maybe in some cases, you know, just support about. So I think I would normalize the anxiety and the nervousness in some spaces initially. Sure, everybody goes through it at some point in time. And it's that process of becoming that allows for that nervousness and anxiety to begin to just kind of not be as impactful. That's kind of been my experience.
I think one of the key pieces too, right, is to, like, I'm hearing the normalization of the experience and to acknowledge that this is very real. Because it's easy for us to say, like, okay, here's how you can cope with it, but not to deny it, but to acknowledge that this is a very real experience. Something that also, I think in terms of for our audience today, what I'm sitting with is also, what is a key piece is understanding representation and praxis, right? So what is the racial and cultural climate of the space you're walking into? Because sometimes, yes, like, while you may be the only one, it may be a place where they embrace you authentically. And if that's the case, then I say that is it too. And that can be an antidote. Not all of it, but one of. And so I think that's one of the pieces I'd offer. And I know we'll cover this in some of the other questions too. I think a lot about peer mentorship. So not just mentors, right? Like who have like several years of experience, but also peer mentorship. That kind of solidarity is so much more healing than we often think it is. You know, I think there are still colleagues and peers who I talk to on a frequent basis and who say, like, especially there are days where I'm like, do I know what I'm doing today? Like, do I really know what I'm doing? And then they're the people who say, yes, like they affirm you. They affirm you, and not just to say like, but more so in a way that says you do matter and you do belong and you are valuable. And I think that is so much more healing and powerful than we often think it is.
I don't know if you guys are seeing the questions, but one of them said that, and believe it's responding to you, Dr. Smith, saying that when you have to perform academically or professionally, it's a different anxiety than when you go into the bank and you're the only one. That how do you handle that when you're expected to be whatever the expectation is in that meeting? And then another question is about the imposter syndrome and the assumptions of affirmative action. The only reason you're in the job is because they had to fill a quota.
And I think those tie together in some cases, right? That do I belong here question pops up, and imposter syndrome influences that anxiety and nerves. Absolutely. Absolutely. I know I dealt with a little bit of imposter syndrome. I did.
Yeah.
I did.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. And I read the question too and understand the comparison, but I'm still going to go back to high school, undergrad. What were your experiences being the only in those spaces? How did you deal with them? Did you deal with them? Where were you at developmentally? Where did you grow into? The performance piece. completely understand that. But I'm asking those questions as a self-reflection of, are you able to identify what worked before, maybe work now, maybe can't work now, and what resources might you be able to tap into? That's why I'm asking the question. Because our past experiences do help us grow and move forward.
Awesome. I mean, it's evident that there are so many angles to look at this from. And so I think the value in having those different angles is you can identify where each situation you find yourself in kind of gets spoken to by all these different angles and ways to process what may be happening in that moment. Another question is, I'd like to know how to continue to manage my personal reactivity to topics involving BIPOC history and issues of discrimination, of how to continue managing my personal reactivity to topics involving BIPOC history and discrimination. And you know, personal reactivity, when I think of reactivity, it can look so many different ways.
Yeah.
So many different ways.
I'm wondering if this is kind of like, oh no, not again, kind of reactivity. That's how I'm reading it. Like, why do we have to continue hearing about the BIPOC experience? But maybe you guys are reading it differently.
I want to acknowledge too that especially being mindful is, and I think this is especially for several of the counselor educators who are teaching courses, right? Being mindful of when you're inciting and replicating race-based trauma into your spaces, right? And I think that's to be mindful too, right? Acknowledging like walking into the space and understanding, what am I doing that's actually making sure that I'm driving home the point that this is a very real experience, but not inciting race-based trauma in this space over again. And like, I think in that's also what I carry away from that question. And also like essentially the response, right? From our students, but also from ourselves, like when we're responding to race-based trauma and histories of that, generations of that. And I think in many ways, what I'll also say is, sometimes it's okay, right? I come back to Dr. Smith's point earlier about disengagement. Like sometimes it's okay, like to take that space for you, to say like, I can't, like, I need to protect my energy right now.
I hear that question differently than you do, Dr. Suarez. I hear that question from my experience of being reactive when I watch certain movies, and when I hear when white folk come to me and say, well, did you read this book, or did you see this movie, right? I still have not watched When They See Us. I can't do it. I can't do it. Just looking at the picture on Netflix, just, right? And that's my reactivity space. There are certain things that I just cannot do. And one of the things that I have allowed myself grace for is that I don't actually have to watch it all.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to read it all. I know my history. I know a lot of history, right? And just because you think it is the thing of the moment to read or to watch, and it's helping you become more educated, loving that, fantastic. That doesn't mean that I have to, and that I should feel guilty because I haven't, right? That's what I had to get through and get over, right? And now I don't, right? And so that's how I managed my personal reactivity to topics around BIPOC history, by giving myself grace to know what I know and sit with it. And when I can't sit with anymore, don't expose myself to more. And that is okay, because there will come a time when I can do a little bit more and learn a little bit more in a different way, and that'll be fine too. I think that's what comes to me when I think about my own personal reactivity.
And I so appreciate your statement, Dr. Sutherland, and also Dr. Chan on this piece, particularly when we're talking about managing our own ways to react, right? While we talk about in the classroom, some of our white counterparts, counselor educators, are being mindful of doing that. And I'm going to say it, us BIPOC counselor educators and faculty and supervisors also need to be mindful of potentially re-traumatizing individuals based on race with what's going on as well. And I think all of us can be even more mindful of what we take in. As you just shared, you haven't watched that, and you're okay right now in watching it because of your script already. I watched George Floyd that 8 minutes and 41 seconds once. I haven't seen it again. And I've shared this with many of the panel members here. I shut down for a week because I had to grieve and mourn, not only for George, but for every other individual that has suffered the similar act that ended their lives. And I'm a combat medic, 15 years, several tours. So that impacts us more than we actually realize it. So we have an opportunity to say, no, I don't need to relive that. I'm living it now, and this is enough. You know, there's a point in time I think we have to tell ourselves this is not a badge to wear. Excuse me. This is not a game to wear the largest badge of trauma. It's all hurtful and painful, and we have to recover from it. So I think I don't need to engage in this, and it's okay to say, you know what, I need to step out right now because I don't need to be in this space. It's completely okay to do that. So that's another way I'm looking at this question as well. Of you know what, I can step away, and this is why. If my leg was broke, you would respond. Just because you don't see my potential hurt or pain, it doesn't mean it's any less.
I'll just add one more thing to what you said, Dr. Smith, because what you and I both identified were the feelings under the reactivity. I identified guilt and you identified grief. And so part of managing that is identifying what the underlying emotion is to the reactivity. That's what a key is going to be as well, to be able to manage that. Yeah.
That's really good, that self-reflection of why am I reacting this way?
Yeah.
I like that.
How do you manage or reduce battle fatigue while also holding the uninformed accountable for seeking knowledge? How do you manage or reduce battle fatigue while also holding the uninformed accountable for seeking knowledge? My short response, and I'll throw it over to everybody else, is I don't take responsibility for informing everyone. And that's how I manage that. I do it in my own authentic spaces in the course of my life, but I try not to take on more in the name of informing or holding people accountable for what they need to hold themselves accountable for.
And that's a process. It's a process to get to. That's that growth piece. Again, I'm tapping back into our profession. We're selling it, so we should be buying it, right? Mm-hmm. Counseling works, and it will look different for everyone, right? It will look different for everyone. So I think part of that growth is doing that self-reflection piece, developing those skills to best cope, being able to identify, this is a space I can engage, and then how I will engage, pin or hammer, right? Calling in or calling out, or, you know what, I need to disengage. I need to take a time out. But if we are not practicing what we're selling, if we don't have a group, a counseling group, a support group, a person, someone, or something, we're going to be harming our clients much more than helping them.
I want to add to that, because my first instinct when I read the question was, when I am fatigued and tired of the battle, is to have friends that understand that community that is there to say, okay, what part of this is just part of the battle and what part of it is my stuff, you know, and being able to vent probably isn't the right word, but be able to just share, like, this is what happened today. This is what someone said to me. Am I overreacting? Am I putting intention in it, or is it something that I need to address? And kind of be able to talk it out with someone who is trusted and understands.
I would say one of the strategies, I always talk about this, especially with mentees, BIPOC mentees, protect your time and energy. I know that's what I do. I protect my time and energy. And in terms of picking battles, right? Deciding, okay, well, maybe this is something I'm going to address, but this is not what I'm going to address right now. And because sometimes there's also this point about, you know, I remembered hearing this in another conversation, but also the point about white urgency. It's like always like asking us to respond constantly. And it's like, no, I can take some time. I can take some time for me. I can protect my time and my energy. And then of course, like when you think about, okay, how do I also address the racial battle fatigue in that culminating chronic experience, right? What I would say, I also think about is like, what restores you? Is it community that restores you? Is it something else, right? Like what are the other parts of our wellness that restore us? And I know for me, it's like, of course, it's like my community restores me, but also at the same time, I also talk a lot about writing as healing. That writing is what I do because writing is what I find healing. So I write because it's healing to me.
Hmm.
I want to make sure to get in this question addressed to you, Dr. Suarez. So I want to jump to this instead of going to another question that we had before. It says, I would love to hear more about your experience of being white passing, but at the same time, being on the receiving end of racism, or just feeling like you don't fit into the dominant culture, or even being an immigrant and what that's been like for you, if that is part of your story. Being in the middle is sometimes weird and can often feel like you are misunderstood. The pain is real, but it is often minimized by white Americans, but sometimes even other BIPOC individuals as well.
Wow. Thank you for that. Yeah. Okay. So let me explain. I'm not an immigrant. I was born in New York City, actually in Queens, Sonia. And so, but my mom's from Nicaragua. She only came here when she got married. My dad's family, both parents came from Spain. So I'm just giving you the first generation college for me. But it's an interesting place to be, but I have seen it as a bridge. I feel like I have, in some situations, I can speak up on racial issues where it might not be heard. And I've seen this happen where a colleague is saying things and they're not being heard because of the, you know, and I have worked at PWI, predominantly white institutions, and then I can say the same thing and be heard, and it frustrates me, and yet I have come to the place where I think I can be a bridge between my community and the dominant community, and using understanding. I was educated here in the US, so understanding some of how I hate the they, but how the people think, and then how to say, okay, you're saying it this way, but can I give you another perspective? And here's how it feels. And so that's how I'm trying to make sure I've covered. I feel like you're misunderstood. I do feel like I am misunderstood. And a lot of times, to be honest, people will say, even when I say, I'm Latina, they're like, no, you're not, you're Italian. Now, there's no Italian in my background, but it's people's experience of wanting me to be part of them. Like, if I like you, I want you to be like me, and having that disconnect of like, I'm not. And if you dig into my background, you'll see that my experience was not what your experience was. From early on, I was told by my guidance counselor that I didn't need to talk about college because I wouldn't go to college. I was going to get married by the time I was 18 because I was Latina. I'm like, what? But anyway, those kind of experiences have helped me to kind of feel like I can bridge, but I do get misunderstood. And sometimes what my colleagues are saying is, sometimes I fight it, and sometimes I just pull back and decide, is this a place where I want to use my energy, and is it going to make a difference? So do you feel like have I answered that? The pain is real, and it is minimized, and people don't understand. And that, like, because you look like me, the predominant culture, then you don't understand what that's like. But in some ways I do. In some ways I don't. So I live in that tension.
And I think this is a great example, Dr. Sora's story of, above all, tapping into our humanism. If we really tap into just people's experience, we can get closer than further away, if that makes sense. Because again, pain is pain. The experience and the story of the pain may be different, but pain is pain.
Right.
Not being understood is not being understood.
And trying to justify my presence in whatever space it is,
Right.
that I belong here, gets exhausting sometimes.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm glad I'm here too. But that is, it takes its toll. And so for the person who asked, Andrea, who asked this question, it does. And yet I have other ways to support myself and encourage myself, and realize that I have worked just as hard, if not harder, than the other people in that space. And hey, I'm late in my career, but I'm getting my voice even more than I used to have. And I'm grateful for that. We were talking about that in our prep meeting with Dr. Chan and Dr. Sutherland. But it's taken a while because I would say things and I would get ignored. And that hurts, because then someone else says the same thing and they're like, wow, that's a brilliant idea. And I'm like, it's just kind of, where's my voice? But I'm finding it. It's a long journey.
And this is a space that I speak on, talk on in classroom, in supervision circles, and that's colorism. It's real, and the more multiracial, multi-ethnic we become in this country, the evolution and the presence of that piece is going to be even more highlighted. And we have to engage in dialogue around it. We have to. I'm the darkest one in my family. All right. That's created a lot of issues growing up. Okay. But it's there. I mean, the element of colorism across the board, we have to be prepared to learn about it, talk about it, develop skills around how to engage that very topic in the field, and then also, you know, personally in that work. So great question, Andrew and Dr. Suarez. Thank you for sharing, because that's, for me, that it takes me back to that piece of colorism.
Mm-hmm.
And this also something that I've been sitting with here in the questions and in the reflections is also what kind of narrative got crafted by white supremacy, right? Historically, because that's also what happens, is that white supremacy also creates narratives to weaponize Black, Indigenous communities of color against each other. And that's also what's happening too. And the second piece is that we also, as BIPOC leaders and counselor educators, faculty members, administrators, we're not immune to white supremacy. We can internalize white supremacy too. And so that's why it's an iterative process, right? It's not one that just, oh yeah, like because of who I represent and who I am, that it ultimately makes me immune, right? Sometimes we adopt and internalize white supremacy.
And sometimes unwittingly, right? We can do a lot of work, yeah.
And then I think once realizing it, just being able to manage the guilt and not allow that to tank you, right? Because we're just human too. And going through, like you said, this iterative process.
Dr. Sutherland, and this is going to go left. I'm just putting it out there now. All right, I'm just putting it out there. But you brought it up, and I actually think it's something to be worthy for those that are here attending. You brought up that piece of the guilt and being okay with it. What do you do with that guilt when you recognize it? You realize it. You see it. Where does that guilt go? Do you carry it? Do you put it down? Where is it at?
I think the other side to that question is not necessarily where it is, but how to use it, how to leverage it, right? To move forward. I just think that guilt, in my experience, has been part of the process of awakening, right? Over and over again, to do different aspects, new nuances, right? And so I almost feel like it is, for me, a little bit of part of my process of recognizing that I missed something, feeling guilty because I did, because I'm really supposed to be more woke than that. And then going, okay, but I have history like everybody else. So how do I use this? How do I leverage it? How do I let it inform, what I want, how I want to show up moving forward? And that's and then the guilt goes where it helps me and then goes. It's gone because now I'm moving forward. I've learned what I've learned and I'm moving forward. So it's a process. If you asked me this question at 30, it might have been a different answer. But at 53, 53 is a good age.
Dr. Chan, Dr. Suarez, same question.
I think there's, so sometimes I think we've created also a culture, right? And I see this happen so much in counselor education spaces, in the whole counseling profession. When that guilt shows up, we tend to try to walk away from it. But really what I'm asking for, not only from each other, right, but for myself, is ownership, right? Is ownership, because that is what, when I think about how do I work through this guilt with ownership, then it brings me back to accountability, because that's ultimately what I want, is accountability. Not just for all of us, but for me too. I'm holding myself accountable.
Did that answer your question, Dr. Smith? What do you do with it?
It did. It did. Again, it's situational. I mean, it really is. But I do something with it. If that, you know, if we're going to go step into the Gestalt world, right? I don't put it in. I don't put it somewhere and then leave it on the shelf and walk away with it. No, I'm like, okay, so that situation happened. What did I learn from it? Okay, what space and what privilege might I have in certain spaces that I'm going to leverage it, right? So that's what I tend to do. And do I get down on myself? Yep. Do I have those conversations with myself? Yep. And do I need to reach out to some folks and say, hey, this is what happened. What do you think? Yes. But at the end of the day, I would say there's a piece of that guilt that fuels me to learn from that and re-engage in a different way, in a better way.
I will jump to the final question before we close. We only have a few minutes, but it's an important question, I think. What are some practical strategies, such as language or questions, that faculty can use to join the conversation? And I'm thinking also to initiate the conversation without pushing responsibility onto BIPOC students, right? What are practical strategies that faculty can use to join the conversation or initiate the conversation without pushing responsibility onto BIPOC students for doing so? I think probably one of the first things to recognize, especially if you are a white faculty, a lot of times I hear white faculty back away from it and say, I'm not really qualified to talk about race, diversity, things like that. And I want to encourage white faculty not to back away with that type of thinking, right? All you need to have to talk about race and discrimination is a willingness to hear the experiences of other people, right? The willingness to speak your truth around some of your experiences as well, and willingness just to listen and encourage others to listen without judgment, right? Basic counseling skill, non-judgmental, positive regard, right? And so while you may have, we may have a lot of education or a little education or whatever you want to call it, have education to pursue, that doesn't mean that we're waiting to be more educated to be qualified to talk about race, discrimination, and issues like that. I think that's probably a foundational piece to think about.
I mean, I would add to what you said, but not really add, but enhance, or is listening. I mean, we go back to hearing the stories, but really hearing, not putting our emphasis on it, but hearing the experiences of people that are of our BIPOC students, I'll just say, and using, yeah, I agree with that, Dr. Sutherland, and not asking BIPOC students to represent their culture,
Yeah.
whatever that is, in the classroom so that discussion can be had. I mean, these are basics, but it you know, that's a lot on one person's shoulder, and it's only one person's experience.
Sure. And I would say too, even before you do that in the classroom, do that with other people first.
Yeah.
You have conversations with peers like you and unlike you, right? And ask those kind of questions. You know, what comes up for you? What's it like for you when you talk about race? Here's what it's like for me when I talk about race or diversity, right? What would you be concerned about if it came up in your classroom? Here's what I'm concerned about. And talk. Begin to have that dialogue. Yeah. And even before broaching in the classroom. Dr. Chen, I think I may have interrupted you. I think you were off mute and wanted to say something.
I was going to put out there in terms of what can be helpful for reflection and reflexivity for counselor educators is to understand like where your social location is, right? And I say that because understanding what power structures may influence those interactions in the classroom. And I say that because otherwise it could easily fall into creating multiple forms of tokenization and cultural taxation for BIPOC students. Like, it's like, what? Like, I have to carry this now? And that is so much more harmful, because what you're also saying is now you're imploring or encouraging white students to then go to their colleagues or BIPOC colleagues to then carry that burden too. So I think being mindful of when it particularly you hold that power in that space. And so that's why I come back to those social structures of power and how it can be really helpful in taking ownership when it's appropriate.
And what I would just add quickly, I know someone asked in the chat room resources for multi-ethnic population. AMCD, we do have a concerns group specifically on that topic. Regina Finan is the vice president of that group. So there's a contact information, reach out to her. She'll connect you with others that are in the same space. But I would, my thing is this, it may sound like pretty duh, but I hope, well, not even hope, have these conversations that we're having right now in your department meetings. Have these conversations in your offices, you know, have these conversations intentional. How are you creating these spaces in the department? Who are we hiring as our support staff, our admin staff? What does our sites look like? Who do our supervisors look like? Who do our adjuncts look like? And are they part of this dialogue that we're having regarding creating this space for our BIPOC students and how to properly, ethically, authentically engage in these dialogues and discussions? Just be intentional about all of it. Because if we're not talking about it in these spaces, it ain't happening. I'm just putting it out there. It is not happening. And we need to be. Just as we're talking about grades, evaluation, just as we're talking about counseling someone out of the program, we need to be talking about this as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We are at the end of our time, and as usual, there's more to be said. But I'm glad that we got through a lot of what we got through. I would just add a couple other really practical things. If you're going to have these conversations, obviously set some ground rules about interaction. That's just a really practical tool. You can avoid tokenism in your classroom in terms of your BIPOC students by kind of like setting up a system for equal opportunity responding, right? So don't leave it up to people just to kind of try to figure it out. Figure out a way. Put numbers in a hat. Everybody gets a number, and you respond in order. Just things like that that can help your BIPOC students not be the ones to actually have to field things. So there's a lot more. We don't have time to really talk about more, and I'm so sorry about that. But thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your questions that have broached all of this conversation. There's more to come. Some of you have sent in other topics that you would like to have discussed, and we'll certainly take a look at those as well. So please continue to communicate with us, and we would love to hear from you. Dr. Suarez and Dr. Smith and Dr. Chan, thank you for your wisdom. As usual, y'all are fantastic. And we will see you guys next time. Be well, everybody.
March 4th. March 4th.
Next week. That's
It's
right.
next week for those that don't know. So
See you then. See
All
you
right.
then. Take care.